Now let me show you how to add a drop-down list to this form. So back in our template, just before our JSON object, I'm going to add a div with the class form-group. Inside this div, we want a label. And next to this label, we want a select with the class form-control. Now we can give this select an ID attribute. So ID, we set this to, let's say, contact method. Now we can use the same value as the for attribute of the label. So square brackets, for, we set this to contact method. Now put the cursor at the end and press tab. All right, so here's our markup. We have a div with the class form group. Inside this div, we have a label and a select. Now, just like other input fields, we need to apply the ng model directive on our select. And we should also set the name attribute. So contact method. Now let's set the actual label here. So contact method. And finally, we need to populate this drop-down list. So as you know, in HTML, we have one or more options inside a select element like this. However, in most real-world applications, we don't hard code these options here. Most of the time, we call an API on the server to get, let's say, the list of contact methods. And then we populate this drop-down list dynamically. So let me show you how to do this. We go back to our component. Here, I'm going to define a field called contact methods. So for now, we don't want to worry about getting these objects from the server. Let's imagine somehow we got these objects. Now they are available in our component. So contact methods. I'm going to set this field to an array of objects. Each object should have two properties. One is ID, and the other is name. So name is what we show to the user, and ID is what we send to the server for persistence. Now let me duplicate this. So for the second object, I'm going to use ID2 and name phone. Now back in our template, let's delete these hard-coded options. We want to render these options dynamically. How do we do this? You already know that. We use the ng4 directive. So option, tab, we apply the ng4 directive here. Let method of contact methods. And then we use property binding with this value property. So we bind this value property to method.id. And for the label, we use interpolation. So we render method.name. Let's have a look at the result. So back in the browser, okay, this is our contact method drop-down list. You can see email is selected by default, but in our JSON object, contact method does not have a value because this value is only set when we make a selection here. In other words, when I set this to, let's say, phone, now the value of contact method is changed. So in a lot of real-world applications, we don't want a value to be selected here by default. We want to have an empty option and enforce the user to make a selection. So back in our template, I'm going to add another option here, just a blank option with no value. Save, back in the browser. So look, currently, contact method doesn't have a value. And then when I set this to email, okay, now the value is 1. So this is how we work with drop-down lists. Now let's take this to the next level. In most applications, you want to send only this value to the server, like 1. But sometimes you may want to set the value of this contact method property to the actual contact method object. That is the object with two properties, ID and name. Let me show you how to do this. First, let's inspect this drop-down list. So we have the select and a couple of options. Now each option, as you can see here, has a value attribute. This value attribute can only be a string in HTML. So we cannot store an actual contact method object here. To solve this issue, we need to go back to our template. And instead of binding the value property, we need to bind ng value. So ng value is an attribute directive that exposes the ng value property. And we can bind this to a complex object, like the method or contact method object. Now let's look at the result. So back in the browser, note that when I select a contact method here, the value of contact method property is an actual object. Here we have an object with two properties, ID and name. Once again, in most applications, you don't want to do this, but if you really want to set the value of a property to a complex object, you use the ngValue property instead of the standard value property. So back in our template, I'm going to change this back to value and bind it to method.id. Now let me show you one last thing. Sometimes you want to allow the user to select multiple options. So here we can apply the multiple attribute. So multiple. Now back in the browser. So this is the interface for a drop-down list that supports multiple selection. I can select email, hold down the shift, select phone, and now look at the value of the contact method property. It's an array of integers, 1 and 2.